Hello and welcome to Theater Operations Unleashed, the monthly show that explores the ins and outs of theater operations, management, facilities, and design. I'm your host, Raymond Kent. In each episode, we will be focusing on management, operations, design, trends, and best practices in the performing arts. I hope to bring you both insights from my 4 decades in the industry, as well as engaging conversations with theater professionals about the challenges and rewards of their work. We'll also cover a wide range of topics from budgeting and scheduling to marketing and audience development, theater technology, and many other related topics. Whether you're a theater maker yourself or just interested in the industry, I hope you'll find this podcast informative and inspiring. So sit back, relax, or lean in, and let's dive into the world of theater. Hello and welcome to Theater Operations Unleashed. I am here today with Raymond Bobgan. He is the Executive Artistic Director of Cleveland Public Theater. During his tenure, Raymond has produced 65 world premieres, a majority of which are by women and artists who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. As an artist, Raymond creates new performances that are bold, multi-layered, and highly physical through an ever-evolving ensemble process. Raymond's work has been seen in Romania, Brazil, Denmark, Serbia, South Korea, Turkey, and the United Kingdom, and in Canada. Raymond initiated the formation of Teatro Publico in Cleveland, and CPT's resident Latino theater company, Masra Cleveland Al Arabi, a group dedicated to creating and performing theater from Arabic-speaking communities, and Station Hope, a community arts festival exploring contemporary issues of social justice. Raymond founded the Student Theater Enrichment Program, STEP, a job training theater program for teens, and co-created the Y Haven Theater Project with James Levin, which engages formerly homeless men in writing and performing theater. Raymond was the first recipient of the Cleveland Arts Prize in the discipline of theater, and he is a 2-time winner of the Creative Workforce Fellowship and a recipient of the Ohio Arts Council Fellowship. Raymond has received the Cisgender Ally Award in Cleveland's Transgender Day of Remembrance and Equality, Ohio's Ally Award. In 2018, he was honored with the Cleveland Foundation's Homer C. Wadsworth Award, and in 2017, his administrative leadership was recognized with the Governor's Award for the Arts in Ohio. Raymond was president of the board of directors for the National New Play Network from 2018 to 2020 and recently returned to the board to co-chair their strategic plan. He also serves on the board of Theater Communications Group and is chair of the Gordon Square Arts District Cleveland Improvement Corporation. Raymond, my friend, it is great to have you. I appreciate you taking the time today. We go back a couple decades now, working together on some of these initiatives like STEP and Y Haven, and certainly I've had the pleasure of designing shows and collaborating with you on a number of things. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here.
Sure. I would love to talk to you a little bit more in particular around CPT and its unique mission, right? You guys have got this really great community connection that a lot of professional theaters strive for, but don't always achieve, right? Can you talk a little bit how your vision drives that mission with CPT and its intersection with the community?
Yeah, our mission is to raise consciousness and to nurture compassion. And we do that with groundbreaking performance and life-changing education programs. A lot of theaters talk about like adventurous and bold programming. And then I look at their programming, I'm like, yeah, that's pretty much what's going on at most theaters. We really take that idea of groundbreaking pretty seriously. It could be groundbreaking because it's addressing some hard issues to talk about, complex issues, which I think are really the best places for art to sort of be wielded as a tool for community and for democracy. These complex issues like policing, we commissioned a piece by Nicole Salter just to look at Cleveland policing and a consent decree between the DOJ and the city of Cleveland. And also our groundbreaking work is really looking at this form of what theater is and has been. You know, one of the elements of white supremacy culture throughout time is to sort of define what is excellence. Right. And that definition comes through the group of people who are currently sort of controlling resources. And they say, this is excellent, this is not excellent. For example, going on point. we can all say going on point in a wonderful ballet performance is a form of excellence. But there are other forms of excellence that those dancers who are going on point can't even begin to approximate in forms like African dance. And I think that this is something that we think about a lot at CPT from a theater viewpoint. What really is theater? What are the limits of it? And maybe more and more, maybe we're more about performance than we are necessarily in this rigid view of theater, and really exploring what all that means. That doesn't mean we're not doing plays. We still do some, mostly plays actually, but we're also exploring a lot of other territory, and those plays tend to be a little bit not the typical structure that you might see at a mainstream theater in our country.
So, you touched on something there about social activism, right? Through the art that happens at CPT. What strategies do you use to select what avenues you want to go down? Because some can be very hot button topics, right? And not that they shouldn't be discussed. I mean, right, look at what's going on today, right, with what's happening over in Israel with Hamas. I mean, that's a very, very delicate topic in many ways. But arts are a way of healing, a way of discussing, a way of educating, a way of learning. So when you start to look at these items that you want to go down, whether it's the consent decree for Cleveland and the police department, how do you do that in terms of programming, and how do you lead people into that discussion?
Well, one of the things I talked about before was life-changing education programs. We're offering programs, to hundreds of children who live in public housing and connecting to those families. We're providing employment to teens from the city of Cleveland, and connecting to those families. I think one of the things about Cleveland Public Theater is just the permeability of the organization, and the artists that we center are not separate from community in the first place. Right? When a majority of your cast comes from out of town, you are inherently not connected to your community. And this could be a question of excellence, right? So you could look at a cast and one group might say, this is an excellent cast. These are some of the top performers in our country, and most of them reside in New York. And that, I agree with that. There's another excellence that we could look at. We could say, excellent theater companies are able to cast their entire show from their own community, right? And that there is meaningfulness in that. And there is something about what happens in the heart of the audience when that happens. So sometimes someone one time said to me, well, there's a big difference between a great show and an excellent show. Some of the most excellent shows aren't even that great. And I'm like, okay, you've just hit on it, right? And so I think for CPT, how do we determine what we're doing? It's not like we're in some, separate place from community. I'm not spending most of my time in fundraising rooms, although some, most of the time I'm spending time in rooms with people who live in Cleveland and live in the neighborhoods of Cleveland. So inherently, those are the voices that are at the table and that are in my mind and the artist's mind who are here. And also I'll say, I would say maybe 2 to 3 world premieres a year at Cleveland Public Theater are by local artists. So it's really about, we say, by, for, about, with, when you're working in community, you can't just say, oh, we're going to bring in these artists from out of town, from a community, and they're going to represent a Cleveland community. No, it doesn't work like that. And this is something that's really, I really want to push into this sense of excellence. No one in American theater should hire me to produce a major new musical at a full union house. I don't have the skills or the experience to do that. But it's remarkable how the same theaters that do those kinds of productions think that they have the skills that I have, and that they can simply say, oh, we'll be more connected to the community now. No, that doesn't happen overnight. Just like it wouldn't happen overnight that I could produce a big scale musical at a union house. These are skills we deepen over time in life, and there are different kinds of excellences.
I completely agree. In my career, I've had a number of people say to me, we want you to design a world-class theater. Well, what does that world-class theater mean to you?
Yeah.
Right.
Why
And
design it
often,
world class?
yeah,
Why not
often
design it for this city, for this community?
exactly, I always give them the answer back of, what to me takes to make world class theater are three things, three basic components: a great story, someone to tell that great story, and someone to listen. That's it. That is all you need. And if you can make that connection, you know, uh, that's world class. If everything else melts away, and I often tell my students, the same thing. And I said, think about a time when you're sitting around a campfire, or sitting in your living room, or sitting there with your family, and somebody starts telling a story, and how you get so enwrapped in that story. That's world class theater. It doesn't mean that you're sitting in a fancy seat with a beautiful architecture and everything else. Those are nice to have. But they don't help move that story along. They don't
Yeah,
make that human connection, which I think from a community aspect, CPT does very well.
yeah.
You know?
Thank you. Thank you.
And
And I think the other thing about that, I don't know what makes world class. I know about the times I'm sitting in an audience and I say, wow, what a gift to get to be in this room.
right.
And those moments are moments when something on stage is happening that is so essential to the audience that's watching it.
Yep.
Being in a performance where when we first opened Must for Cleveland at Ottaby, watching a acquaintance of mine, a professional in our community, in the front row, and they were literally weeping and about 5 minutes into the show. And I'm like, wow, I wonder if they're okay. The show's not very upsetting at this moment. It's just going along. And I talked to them afterwards and they said, you don't know what it's like to be, a successful business person in my 50s. And this is the first time in my adult life I have ever heard my language spoken on stage.
Wow.
And you can feel that in the audience. And when you're sitting in that audience, it's like, I don't know anymore what is excellent theater, but this experience is life-changing for me.
Sure.
And
Sure.
or like the Whitehaven Theater Project, a program we do every year with homeless adults who are in treatment for drug and alcohol addiction. We in this one show, this one actor says, this is too much for me to handle. I need to use. And every night we perform, people in the audience would like shout out, don't do it, or no, or there was this visceral sense in the audience that what's happening on stage could be life or death for those of us in the audience, literally. What we're
Yeah.
talking about is so important. And I think that for me is really what makes great theater. I don't know if it's world class,
Yeah.
because I don't know what that means. And the other thing I'll just say is something happened in American theater that makes a lot of sense to me, and I understand why it happened.
Okay.
But it has resulted in a problem. In the early part of the first half of the 20th century or whatever, second half, as we were really getting this regional theater movement going, there was this idea that we were going to have professional theaters. And this idea that we were going to have professional theaters located in our communities, and these actors and directors should be respected, not as amateurs, but as professionals who are at the top of their class. And the way we chose to do it as a field, not me, I wasn't there, but the way we chose to do that as a field was to differentiate our brand. There are two kinds of theater: community theater and professional theater. And
Right.
that set American professional theater in a momentum that was deliberate. In order to have status, we will not be connected to community theater. And that division is why, in my opinion, is at the heart of why We See White American theater had to be written, because the theaters were so disconnected from community by design, by intent. I get it. We wanted to be professionals. We needed to differentiate ourselves. But the way we did it has resulted in a huge wound in American theater that we are now dealing with across this country. And I think there's a lot of ways we're going to solve the wound. One way, a lot of theaters are going to go much more into mainstream. They're going to go into more musicals. We're going to see tons of Three Musketeers and Sherlock Holmes and some one-person shows based on a famous person that everyone's interested in, right?
Right.
But there's also going to be this movement of theaters that are like CPT, and we are not alone. You know, look at places like Company One in Boston. You look at Mosaic Theater in DC. You know, these amazing theaters that are deliberately multiracial. You know, Crowded Fire in San Francisco that's doing some really interesting work. You look at a place like Perseverance Theater and the way they're connecting to the indigenous communities there. You know, it's just, we're not alone here. There's a bunch of theaters that are saying, hey, this situation where professional and community theater are at two ends of the spectrum is a completely false dichotomy that has been created. And actually, we believe that the most excellent theater is at its essence, community theater, at its most essence.
Oh, I completely agree with you. And I look at a lot of those regional theaters now that are struggling and shutting their doors.
Yeah, and then only a few are shutting their doors. They have some pretty big endowments.
Well, they do. They do.
They might be decreasing in size.
But who's providing those endowments, right? Like, where does that money come from? And does, you know, that in some ways helps perpetuate that maybe disconnect to the community, right? I had a great conversation with this podcast with a colleague of mine, Christina Cruz. Her and I both sort of abhor the phrase arts desert, right? That art is there. Art is there. It's just not observed or it's not celebrated or things like that. But that art comes from the community. And so how do you find ways like in inner Harlem in New York to celebrate that art and give opportunity for these professional artists oftentimes to make that connection with people who you know, like the person you were describing, get to connect on a deeper personal level that might not be reflective in mainstream theater, right? And that's a lot of what why I've enjoyed being connected in and out throughout the decades with CPT, is that sort of connection. I remember working on the STEP program and having these kids coming in and having them write their own show and everything about their own experiences and then performing it and the excitement. And a lot of them had never been on a stage. They knew nothing about acting or any of that other stuff, right? And I think it's more than what we think of as community theater. So many people envision like Waiting for Guffman kind of thing, right? But the community that's producing it can and often does do it at a level that is visceral and does connect in ways that out of town performer who is of a high quality, but they're of a high quality, bringing something else to that community. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, I'm not saying that either. I'm not saying Death of a Salesman is not a great play.
Right.
But I'm also saying there are other qualities that make a great play that Death of a Salesman cannot even approximate. There are different things that make greatness. And unfortunately, we spend so much time in our schools and in our colleges focused so much on a kind of, I'm going to say predominantly white literature, and certainly a Eurocentric literature or approach to literature of how to interpret literature and what to look for and all these things. And that's great. These are wonderful things, but we have that kind of education so that we are acculturated, literally, to appreciate those things, and maybe not acculturated to understand the excellences that might exist within other communities, other cultures.
Sure.
Right? So for example, recently, there was a dance company that we were working with, and there were children on stage. And this, I think, I was talking to a funder afterwards, and they were like, "Oh, isn't it great how they're connected to the community?" And I was like, "This is very interesting." They've just differentiated them in a negative way because they literally were comparing them to a ballet company. But here's the thing, in ballet, it is not part of the tradition to always have a child on stage. You look at certain musical traditions, I think it's pronounced Qawwali music, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan's music. It's actually a tradition and a mark of excellence that a child is sitting on stage with you.
Mm.
Even if they're not singing or whatever, it's so that you demonstrate that you are working with the next generation, that you are bringing up this next generation.
Sure.
So these marks of excellence that we think are objective somehow are so not objective, right? And I think that's the really important thing to think about.
Yeah, your idea of tradition and what you just spoke about is really intriguing to me because you're exactly right. So much of Western theater that is what we would typically call mainstream has been built on generations of Western European theater tradition. And the pandemic, in a lot of ways, as well as George Floyd and the Me Too movement, kind of, in some ways, ripped a Band-Aid off of some of those traditions, right? And how the subject matter is now being addressed and whose voices are now coming to the table, I think is really long overdue for one, but driving things in a very different way. And I was talking with someone else who is in the heartland of America, right, in the middle of nowhere, Missouri, who works in a very conservative town. And some of the things that I see around town here or in other cities that I've been at, maybe a little bit more progressive, she'd never be able to do. She would never be able to have the kinds of community connection that you're talking about and that kind of breaking away from tradition, because the people that financially support that organization are typically white European, Western European, middle class to upper middle class to wealthy individuals that are giving dollars and they have a certain expectation of that.
Yeah.
Don't always have that appetite for expansion.
In what other area of the nonprofit does one's personal taste? I mean, I've never heard someone say, I'm not funding the food bank this week because they're offering hamburgers and I don't really like hamburgers.
Right.
It's ridiculous. People who are making nonprofit donations to support the art that they love,
Sure,
rather than the art that the community needs. And this is what's going to be the big question in the next, I think, 10 or 20 years. Where will the investment lie? Will the investment lie in this professional community theater movement?
mm-hmm.
Or will the investment lie in people essentially making tax-deductible contributions to underwrite the art that they want to see? Right? That is the number one question. We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know yet. What are the big foundations doing? These very large national foundations who do these things where they're like, we want to diversify audience and we're going to handpick these organizations, which are always these kind of stellar, world-class, quote unquote, since you use the term, organizations, and they give them $1 million or $2 million. And you come back 5 years later and you say, what's the impact now? Who's doing the things that were these innovation grants that all were going around the country? Who's still using those innovations, right? Rather than the foundations looking at the field and saying, who is already making the change? My dream is for a kind of reverse funding, where instead of saying, we're going to pay you to diversify your audience, we're going to be like, who's already diversified your audiences? Let's give them more money. That's what I'd like to see. But that's going to be the big question going forward. Where will the resources that go into art, where will they go? And that will determine whether or not we have a temporary theater that continually renews itself based on popular opinion and who is wealthy, or whether we will have a theater that is actually essential to communities. A theater that when the pandemic happens, a theater like CPT, where people were literally reaching out saying, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
What will you do now? People asking for us to move to Zoom. We didn't want to. We did it because people were asking us, because it's an essential service, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that funding model is certainly interesting in many ways. And I mean, money makes the world go round sometimes. But how do you, through your messaging and through your mission and through your vision, help to grow that and help to educate folks about this, right? I mean, I think that's one of the things that you guys do very well. And I know that there are other organizations out there that struggle to do that.
Well,
Um,
we're also super blessed. We're sitting in Cleveland, where we have I think, two of the best local foundations in the nation, the Cleveland Foundation and the Gun Foundation. Here's two foundations that have created relationships with most arts organizations that are so transparent. I have a friend who was running another arts organization, and they had a horrible financial situation, and it was due to some accounting mistakes and all these things. It was quite devastating. And they called me up. They said, "What am I going to do?" And I said, "Call Cleveland and Gun." And they're like, "No, no, no, we can't do that." I said, "No, you need to call them. They're your partners. They're going to be there." And so I think I also get to speak from a very specific kind of privilege, because CPT wouldn't exist without those two foundations.
sure.
And so, I also that also gives me a unique place. And maybe there's not art deserts, but there are definitely funding deserts. I think of some of the amazing work that's happening in New Orleans and how hard it is for them to raise funds, even in places like Detroit that you would think would be, the auto industry funds and all the auto money, right? But no, it's like a funding desert there. It's just, it's wild.
Yeah, I have a client, former client that has that, right? The major funder in town that funded a lot of the arts, uh, the arts block that we designed and helped create, and now they're looking to continue the good work that it's doing. It is literally in the middle of nowhere. But
Yeah.
the funder in the region decided that they were going to fund a hospital instead.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so all of that dried up, and they're sitting there trying to figure out what to do next, right?
Yeah.
Now, I mean, and you also have spaces, right?
Well, it's Cleveland. It's
right?
Cleveland,
Yeah,
the city with the capacity to hold 1 million people and only holds 350,000.
that's
So
right.
we have a wealth of space, maybe too
Yeah,
much for an organization of our size,
yeah.
carrying too much occupancy costs, but whatever.
But you also have some historic venues, right? The Capitol Theater, and
Oh my gosh,
everything
and you're
right there.
bringing up this really interesting idea, which is, how does design and buildings, how is that affected by, if we move away from some of the aesthetics that we've talked about, these kind of European aesthetics of what art is, that we close the outside world out, and I want to do that for my work too, many times. But also, one of the advantages in our space is a kind of almost lack of ability to do that.
Yeah,
The sense that you never know, like from the audience perspective, because you never go through a sound light lock at our theaters.
sure,
And it means that where the lobby ends and the theater begins is actually unclear in both of our spaces.
sure.
There's like the main lobby, and then as you enter the theater, there's like this other lobby that's right around the seating risers, and then you get to the seating risers, right? So there's this sense of like communal in that kind of design aspect. So I think there's also going to be a lot of questions that start coming up that
Right.
really challenge the notions of what we want in our spaces. What is a world-class theater?
Absolutely. And you were reading my mind there, because so often um people are challenged. They have a space, but it doesn't always align with that mission and that vision, right? To allow them to grow that mission, and be able to expand into things. So, that's what we do. We work with people, clients, organizations that either think they want a new space, or feel they need a new space, or need to renovate or add on. And I always question and ask why. What is that new space going to really gain you from a value side? How does that drive what it is you're doing? Are there inefficiencies in what you currently have from an operational standpoint? I like to often think that management and operations drives mission and vision, but also drives facility usage, right? And I think it's sort of like this idea of, well, we need a new building because it'll create some excitement so people will come see our shows. Really? Is that really what
Yeah.
you think is going to bring people in to see the work that you're doing, or how, because again, I go back to those three things that to me makes the quote unquote proverbial world class. And I can add lighting, I can add scenery, I can add costumes, I can add a venue and everything, but that all should be supportive of that story.
Yeah. And it also needs to be supportive of that team that's going to run it. I mean,
Right.
a number of times people have shared theater designs with me and they're like, hey, do you have any pins? And every single time I'm like, there are not enough slop sinks.
Yep.
I don't know how you are maintaining this property. And it's like, and that also gets to issues of equity and things like this.
Yeah.
The sense of just like how we clean our building is important, right? What is the
Yeah.
aesthetic experience of the people on the backside?
Right.
Because it does, everything ends up on stage. Nothing, no matter, in my belief, when you make a work of art, somehow hidden inside that art is every piece that originated to make that art possible.
Sure.
Right. And therefore, like, all of these other aesthetic things are important. The fact that I have a window now in my office is important. It makes a difference to the art that's on our stage, right?
Absolutely. I always look at the stage as the heartbeat of a theater, and giving opportunity to the designers and the technicians and the staff and the performers to be able to produce the best thing that they can produce benefits
Yeah.
everything.
What
Right.
if, one of the things I've been thinking about for CPT, if you're an artist at CPT, you get like a code to the back door,
Mhm.
right? That way everyone just has a key to the building, right? And uh but the one thing it did was something that we didn't intend. And that is now the artists come through one door and the audience come through another.
Mm.
What does this mean? It means something and it impacts the work we do. The artists have to walk around to the back of the building to come in. It's something I really want to figure out. I'm sure we can, and there's probably a simple technological solution to the whole thing.
Yeah.
But it's like, taking the time to be able to do that. It does take some time. But for me, it's like I'm trying to think about things like that.
Is
I'm
it
trying
like
to
a
think about,
democratization? That,
no,
that
it's just there's meaning at there is meaning to the fact that theater takes place in two rooms, right? Most theater.
Mhm.
And it has two entrances, and there's an invisible wall that divides our two rooms.
Yeah.
And what is the meaning of that, right? What happened, for me, what, I'm not saying everything has to be in the round, but because God knows there's all these problems with that, but that have meaning. But there is a difference when I am in front of you and when I am in the middle of you
Yeah.
as a performer, right? So I think that's one of the other things. It just, as I think about it more and more, just when I think about world class for me, I'm just thinking about great theater. I have to keep asking myself questions about that. Where do people come in? How do people experience the building? How does the audience experience the building? How do the artists experience the building? How do the students experience? How does the person who walks off the street because they saw this theater and kind of want to know what's happening in there?
Absolutely. I think when you look at that connection, what's the feedback you get from the artists compared to what you get from the audience, or the designers, or
So
things like
interesting.
that?
Yeah, first of all, artists, they always want, more capacity on some level. If you're talking to designers, right? I wish
Mhm.
we could have this. I wish we had these lights. When will we ever be able to afford an ion board?
Mhm.
Things like this. And you're like, yeah, that's entry level, buddy. That's our big reach, right? So there's gonna be that. But artists also make homes in theaters.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's shocking to me how many theaters. I can think of two theaters here in Cleveland. Their entire design was based on recreating the ineffective space that they had been in before. So
Yep.
they were in a space, a church hall, or in the basement of a building, and they had columns, and they kind of this weird wide space, or they had this other weird thing. And when they went to make their new space, they had so fallen in love with the way they had solved all the problems in the prior space that they deliberately made an ineffectual space, in my mind. But it was effective for them, right? So I think artists kind of find the way to make their space their home.
Absolutely. But do you
Yeah,
think that maybe the change in that space might help innovate and drive new ideas?
totally. Absolutely. And I think this is where the other thing is artists have that and they don't like it when you make change because no one really likes change, right? But for us, so many times artists are also coming in for the first time.
Yeah.
You have one group of the artists who are like, I love CPT because I essentially have a key to the building.
Yeah.
And there are other artists who are like, I'm parking here and I have to walk and I go get dinner over here and I have to walk all the way around the building past the dumpster to
Mhm.
get into this back door. Right. So I think artists have different responses. For us, we have some critical problems that we're still trying to solve. How do we get audiences to come through a singular door, buy a ticket in one place, and not have to go back outdoors? It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
still resolving accessibility issues in some of our older properties that we, got for site control, then everyone wanted to use them, and now it's like, but they're not accessible. So we're
Sure.
still dealing with a lot of real core issues, I think, on the design point.
Yeah. And I think that lends itself to the idea of creativity in a way that, do you think maybe enhances or robs
Mm,
what you are able to do, want to do, like
yeah,
if money were no object in space, like, oh, I'm going to dream big and the sky's the limit, but I have these limitations because I've had a similar conversation with somebody who's like, oh, if money were no object and I could have any space that I wanted, this and the other, they said I'd still want boundaries. I need somebody to give me, you know, guardrails around that to
yeah.
help me define that creativity. Because if the sky's the limit, I don't know where to start.
I totally agree with that. I think I work best inside certain limitations. For me, the limitations that are most galling have to do with artists, time, and pay for artists.
Yeah.
That to me is the most galling limitation, right? It's interesting. The Poor Theater, Grotowski's Poor Theater, is a theater we could not afford,
Sure.
right? He had a cast of 12 actors. They produced very, very few productions a year. They produced theater for a very small audience, theater of 13 rows, I believe it was, before it became the Laboratory Theater. So a very small audience. And those people were paid a reasonable wage of a factory employee. Okay. If I could have a theater that I could work and produce a few plays a year, but spend most of my time in the rehearsal room simply working with a group of 12 actors who are being paid wages that are equitable to someone who works at a car manufacturing plant.
Sure.
That would be extraordinary. That would be totally bizarre in the United States, right? You couldn't fund such a thing. It would be we in the United States can't even afford the Poor Theater. So to me, that's where I want my limits to be removed. Limits of time and limits of space. Oh, that's helpful for me.
Yeah.
Tell me
Yeah.
what
But
I'm playing with.
I'll go back to the funding side of it though, right? We were talking about earlier where where does the money come from? Box office is part of it. Contributed income is another part of it. There's that whole business side of show business that often people struggle with, especially when they get in leadership positions. You and I were talking about that a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
Building the plane as you're flying is a phrase that a lot of people hear me say over and over, that I stole from a very good friend, because that's the way she feels like doing it. But if you look at that, I think oftentimes it's the people that are funding it, not necessarily the ticket, but in some cases they don't understand how the sausage is made, and
Yeah.
so they don't understand the need or the ask often for why theater costs what it costs to be able to pay an artist for what they're worth and produce the work that they're going to come see at a level and quality and in a connected way
Yeah.
takes time and money.
Yeah.
And
And if we want work that has depth,
yeah,
requires more time and energy. I don't think that people expect work with depth in the United States. And I mean something very particular about depth here. But no one's rehearsing 12 weeks for a show,
sure.
right? my dream would be, I've been working with this kind of loose ensemble of about 12, 13, 14 actors. And, these are amazing actors. They range in age from, I think, like 22 to maybe 40 and maybe 45, but it's this big range. It's a BIPOC majority group. And, my dream would be, could I go into a room with them, 30 hours a week for 40 weeks out of the year? What we would make would be phenomenal, but it would not be a big Broadway show. It would have depth in a different way, totally different way. Anyways, I want to share with you a poem. Can I do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to share with you this poem. Kathleen O'Malley, who worked at CPT a while back, a great artist and a great marketing person, and now a great administrator and arts leader, shared this in, like, I think it was her first week she was working here. And that would have been like 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago. I can't remember.
It's been that long. Wow.
The poem is called "We're Building the Ship as We Sail It" by Kay Ryan. The first fear being drowning. The ship's first shape was a raft, which was hard to unflatten. After that didn't happen, it's awkward to have to do one's planning in extremis in the early years. So hard to hide later, sleekening the holes and making things more gracious. I don't think there's a poem in the world that better describes Cleveland Public Theater, some piece of Cleveland Public Theater than that. We started as this raft and we tried to like build it up like this, but it's just never going to work.
Yeah.
And we had to just, in the early days, we were just planning as we go.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So I love that. So for me, it's a boat and not a plane, because planes require a level of physics I don't understand.
Well, think about it like, I think about it like other theaters in town, right, in Cleveland, that are going through some growing pains, right, have had some success and are going through some growing pains. And maybe they just, got LOA with equity, or are starting to hire their first union designers or things like that, right? And there's a whole host of new things that they've got to deal with and follow and everything else that they're utterly not prepared for. But it's, again, that idea of what we've always done and what we need to do, and having that solid vision of how to get there and how your mission needs to evolve around them. But without purpose, I go back to the why. Yeah,
I mean, the thing about Cleveland, and I mean, this is also due to the Cleveland and Gun Foundations, and also the Cuyahoga Arts and Culture, this funding mechanism, that funds arts across our city. So we do have kind of an interesting and robust theater scene. But you just look at what's happened at Obama over the last, 12 years, just phenomenal work, a phenomenal change of approach, a level of production that was just incredible. I go there and I'm like, oh my God, I have to compete with this, And then the leadership at Karamu. I mean, what Tony Size has done.
Oh yeah.
Just remarkable. And I think, one of the things in Cleveland is I firmly believe, in this idea that all boats rise, and that sort of mid-market, this kind of place, Beck Center also, this kind of mid-market theater, looking at what people are doing. Also a theater like Ensemble, maybe not quite in, I don't know where people's monies are and all that. But, these theaters are doing such incredible work, and they're all growing in these really interesting ways. To me, that's where the excitement is right now in Cleveland. If you said tomorrow you're gonna go to one theater, what will it be? It's gonna be one of those theaters.
Sure.
Not a free ticket to Playhouse Square is not right now so exciting to me. I'd rather be, at Clyde's this weekend at Karamu. It's and for me, the time cost more than the ticket. So I think we're in this really special time in Cleveland. There's some great leadership, and there's this great movement happening.
We're also very fortunate here to have some great educational institutions that are supportive. From Kent State, Baldwin Wallace, Oberlin,
Cleveland
State, right?
Cleveland State's interesting. I think that if you looked at the staff at CPT, you would see that Cleveland State is our feeder. Like
Right.
we're this summer, we had 2 technicians who were current students. There was one point where I looked out on my staff and I said, oh my God, like a third of my staff, full-time staff, are graduates of Cleveland State. This is kind of a hidden gem in our community.
Right.
First of all, because this is a school where there are many people who are the first people in their family to be going to college. And at the same time, their approach to theater, their approach to both the technical side, the production side, the acting side is so much more, what do I say, realistic. This is not like we're only training you to work in a touring Broadway show or at a regional theater. We're really thinking about the broader field and where really the work is. And so
and that's again, we're fortunate here, but oftentimes around the country you don't have that. I know of several other comparable sized cities that don't have the academic resources to train that workforce, that dynamic, right? And even beyond beyond college into high school and even junior high, and getting with these parents and the teachers and the guidance counselors to show them that this is actually a viable career path, and to help build that next generation through exposure, more than just being an audience person where they put everybody on a school bus and they take you to the theater and they sit you down and in a nice theater, you go see a show. To really expose the arts in a different way, I think is something that often lacks, and you wind up with some people that have exposure and they latch onto it and they make that happen, but others, they don't get exposed to it till much later in life.
Yeah, and part of that is it happens in poor communities, under-resourced communities, both in inner cities, but also you were talking before about rural communities.
Yeah,
there really has been a sort of, I don't want to say deliberate effort, but in the theater world, we have so fetishized the big cities, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, et cetera, even a place like Atlanta, right? We fetishize these big cities. And the result of that fetishization is that we have almost, that only happens in Canton. That I can't be a great artist. I will never be seen as a great artist because the predominant of my work is for the Cleveland community. And Cleveland is not those cities. In fact, Cleveland has other image issues, right? And so that to me is part of the tragedy of America and what we're facing right now. If you don't teach people about art and fiction, how can they ever know what a fact is?
Sure.
So when suddenly we're in a place where facts and what are facts seem confusing to a large number of people, and I'm like, let's look at what their arts are. Let's look at the arts in their community. How many of them have had the experience, for example, of sitting down, maybe with a family member, and watching a play that is about their lives, watching a play that actually came from their grandfather's, story. How many of them have had honest, earnest, truly essential to them arts experiences?
Exactly.
But it's not here. Let us give you this huge filter and a way to watch this, and we'll explain to you Shakespeare. Right? Before we explain Shakespeare, let's make some awesome theater that is essential to these communities. And suddenly, I think people will begin to understand the difference between fact and fiction. And
right. And I'll go back to the STEP program and the Haven program, right? As I think really great examples of that exposure and the messiness of the making of the art in a different way, more than just, here's a well put together play that we're going to go take you to see, and we're going to tell you everything about it. I think those are two shining examples of that. Talk to me about Pandemonium.
Okay. Yes, we'll shift to Pandemonium. Can I say one more thing about that?
Sure thing. Yeah.
It is so endemic to our community that Oscar Eustis said, the artistic director of the New York Public, said he was talking about the same thing I was just talking about. And then he says, there is no important people working really in these small cities and rural communities. Again, the fetishization, no important artists, because the important artists are the ones I know in New York, right? So by talking about that issue, he betrays his own total bias
Yeah.
Total lack of understanding and thinking that the New York perspective is the perspective to determine this. So anyways, okay, pandemonium.
Pandemonium.
Yeah, speaking of New York, the party that everyone in Cleveland says this is like a New York party, but when people from New York come, say, wow, there's nothing like this in New York.
Yep.
Yeah.
What is it, and why do you do it?
Yeah.
And all the other good stuff.
Yeah, Pandemonium was started by James Levin, our founder, and then artistic director Randy Rollis. The idea was to do something that celebrated Cleveland Public Theater and celebrated our artists, and we should try to raise some money while we're doing it. Okay. It has turned into an event that literally raises somewhere between 15 and 20% of our operating budget.
Wow.
This is a massive fundraiser. It is unlike any fundraiser because you leave your wallet at home. There is no fundraising on the night of the event. Over 200 artists volunteer. We had to go to an application process because too many people wanted to volunteer to create original work for this event than we had space for at the event.
Yeah.
So, and why do they do it? Because they want to be at the party. It's super freaking fun.
Yeah.
Super fun. And when you come as an artist, you're one of the guests. We honor someone in town, and has gained some cachet over time. And that's why we're able to raise, some considerable funds. But the weird thing is, even if we didn't raise the money, we would still have to do something like it. People make things for Pandemonium that end up morphing into plays and musicals that we've produced. And the artists who are working there get to play in a way they don't normally get to play.
Yeah.
And it's super interesting. I mean, you have artists who are like, an artist who like normally writes these like heart-wrenching long pieces. I have to write a play that's going to be at a party.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's super interesting. And it's theater, it's happening all around people, whatever, maybe not theater. Performance is happening all around people.
Right.
Almost all the food is donated from chefs throughout our community who value what CPT does. And we have people rappelling off walls and dancing while they're doing it. We have oftentimes aerial artists, band, and it's everything. It's bands, it's dance, it's.
When I think about, in contrast to say Border Light Cleveland or Ingenuity Festival, right, that are a little bit more formalized and organized in a different way. I mean,
I think one of the beauties of Ingenuity Fest is sort of its sprawling quality.
Oh,
I don't
sure.
know if I would call it organized. I think it's amazing. First of all, there's an event that I just didn't think was going to survive, and now it's doing quite well and it's kind of found its home and its niche.
Yeah,
so that's exciting.
Yeah, Emily Applebaum is doing an amazing job with it.
Yeah, I think she's just done a great job. And then Border Light, Border Light's super important for another reason. I mean, talk about valuing different kinds of excellence.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other piece is like we can be kind of insular here in Cleveland. A lot of times I'm talking to my colleagues or artists in the community that don't really know what's happening nationally, even sometimes.
Yep.
And then being able to have international artists here, I think makes all of us better artists.
Well, I think it elevates the profile to your earlier point about the local and the community, so that those ivory towers of New York and LA, San Francisco, and so on, maybe get an opportunity to go, wow, there's actually really great stuff going on here, and start to pay better attention to.
Yeah.
I appreciate your time today.
Thank you
love
so much.
Always hanging out and talking with you, and your friendship and partnership over the years. And thank you so much for being part of this crazy little podcast here, Theater Operations Unleashed. So I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much. You too.
Take care. Thanks for taking the time today to listening to Theater Operations Unleashed. We hope to see you next month.